Now we're going to move over to personality. Now remember, this entire PowerPoint and my personal notes on that PowerPoint are posted at the end of the lecture series. Okay, so don't feel like you have to write down everything on the screen because it's already given to you, especially those last 3 pages. You're going to have to go over yourself as self-study. Okay, so when it comes to personality, personality is a relatively permanent behavior, characteristics, or traits that you have. Especially by the time you reach adulthood, your personality remains fairly stable. You figured out who and what you are. Now, how we define personality is going to differ based on what psychological perspective is used. You have the humanistic perspective, which is very optimistic and pro people. You have the trait perspective, which is more, oh, you're born with certain personality traits and you get them from your parents, versus the sociocognitive perspective, which believes in reciprocal determination, where yes, the environment has effect on you, but you also affect your environment. Okay, so this is unique, but there are some general traits that they tried to study to identify and label. So first, the humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective focuses on growth and health. Okay, so how do you make a person their ideal self? Well, they believe in free will. This is the opposite of the behaviors theory. Remember, B.F. Skinner said there is no free will. There's only tabula rasa. The environment makes us who we are. The humanistic perspective says no, people have free will and they're more than just objects in their environment. We need to combine their real self, who they actually are, with their ideal self in a process called congruence. So growth, personal growth towards meeting your ideal self. They're going to emerge in response to the behaviors theory and Freud's psychoanalytic theory. They're going to say the behaviorists are too focused on the environment and not enough on free will, and that Freud was too focused on sex and aggression, and he just got weird. Okay, they're going to say focus on the social factors, how society affects, okay, the way that we develop cognitively. And the 2 founders of this perspective are Abraham Maslow, who you already know from the hierarchy of needs, and Carl Rogers, who was a preacher before he turned into a therapist. So what do the humanistic branch, what do these people believe? Well, they believe in something called the self-concept. This is the core to your personality. Your self-concept is how you feel about yourself, with the end goal being real, accurate, honest self-recognition, including of your flaws, and acceptance of your natural self. Okay, and your self-concept is based in self-esteem. So your thoughts and feelings about yourself, but also your feelings of self-worth and feelings of control. Is there an external locus of control or an internal locus of control? Now, one of the things that leads to incongruence and to leads your real self from being far away from your ideal self is relying on a self-serving bias. This is when you'll view yourself as good and everyone else as bad, meaning that your achievements are a result of your natural goodness and other people have put obstacles in your way. And so when you fail, it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault. Okay, so you're responsible for all the good stuff that happens in your life, but not responsible for all the bad stuff that happens in your life. An example of this would be the Tiger King, okay, Joe Exotic. Okay, all of his achievements, that was because of him. He was like, I did that. I built the Tiger Emporium, whatever you want to call it. All of his problems traced back to one source, and it wasn't him. It was Carol Baskin. He's like, the reason I'm in jail is because of Carol Baskin, not because I tried to have her murdered, which is apparently a crime, but because of her. It's her fault and not anything that I had to do with that situation. Or y'all may have heard after Biden's inauguration, they were like wondering if they're going to commute Joe Exotic's prison sentence. And when they didn't, his Twitter posted, I was too innocent and too gay for the Trump administration to commute my sentence. And it's just like, okay, it's everyone else's fault. You had nothing to do with you being in jail right now. It's because you're too innocent and gay, apparently, is what he said on Twitter. It's like, it's a really great example of self-serving bias. It's everyone else's fault, not mine. Okay, so y'all may remember with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is the end goal of that hierarchy. Okay, and all humans are born good, and we naturally move towards this highest level, but sometimes society gets in the way. Society knocks us down on this hierarchy. Okay, at the base, we have the most basic physical needs, food and water, clothing. Then we have safety needs, shelter. Most of us ping back and forth between the esteem and love and belonging tier of this hierarchy. It's very difficult to get to self-actualization, even though that's our end goal. Okay, but society gets in the way. Does society get in the way of shelter? Does it get in the way of basic needs? Sometimes. Okay, like if there's a hurricane that wipes out your house, that's going to move you down on this hierarchy. Okay, but we aim for self-actualization. There's a lot of self in the humanistic perception, self-concept, self-esteem, self-serving bias, self-actualization. It's like their favorite word. And self-actualization is just meeting one's full potential, becoming fully functional. Well, how do you become fully functional? Carl Rogers said that you needed a person-centered approach to therapy. All humans have potential for growth. Even if they're the worst human alive, they can get better. But in order to get better, they need a climate that has these three things. Genuineness, meaning the client and the therapist have to be honest and sincere. The most important one is acceptance. This is the big one. Unconditional positive regard, meaning that the therapist will view the client with no judgment and unconditionally view them positively. So even if they tell them something really awful, they'll still maintain that unconditional positive regard, okay, towards another person to help them in their growth mindset. And then lastly, empathy. Now, sympathy is when you understand what someone's going through because you've gone through it. That's sympathy. Empathy is when you haven't gone through it, but you're trying to understand how they feel. Okay, so even as a therapist, if you can't quite understand what a client is going through, you can still practice empathy and try to understand them, and acceptance, that unconditional positive regard. And that's going to help lead to congruence. Okay, congruence is when your self-concept, your perceived self, molds together with your ideal self. This is called becoming fully functioning. You combine who you are today with who you want to be. That's called congruence. Incongruence is caused by a lack of unconditional positive regard. So if you view yourself or others negatively, your perceived self gets further and further away from your ideal self. So there's no overlap there. They're not becoming one. This is when you become dysfunctional. This is the root, according to the humanistic perspective, the root of psychological issues. It's incongruence, a lack of similarity between your perceived self and your ideal self. Does that make sense so far? All right. So we finished the humanistic perspective. Now we're going to move on to the trait perspective. Okay, first written about by Gordon Allport. Now, Gordon Allport believed that it's not your environment that determines your personality, but rather it's your genetics. So he rejects psychoanalysis and the behaviorist approach of environmental determinism, and instead says, no, you're born with certain personality traits, and then they emerge as you get older. That is the trait perspective. And traits are just stable personality characteristics. Personality characteristics that stay the same over time. So how did he determine what those traits were? Well, he made a bunch of surveys and self-reported inventories. Now, is that empirically based? No. Okay, the surveys can be very subjective. You can have a lot of different opinions getting in the way, and some people may not tell the full truth on a survey. Again, that's self-serving bias. Okay, so this trait perspective isn't necessarily scientifically based, but it's from his trait perspective that we're going to get inventory tests that eventually lead to empirically based science. Okay, Raymond Cattell is going to come up with two traits. The surface traits are the observable behaviors that result from your source traits. And there are 16 total personality factors that make up the source trait. So if y'all have ever heard of the Myers-Briggs inventory, spelled Briggs wrong. Okay, like I'm an ENFJ, right? It has different factors in terms of extroversion versus introversion, intuition versus sensing, thinking versus perceiving. Okay, those are your personality factors that can combine to make different personality types. Okay, it's kind of like a horoscope. It's not really based in science. Now, the reason for that is because this type of personality inventory, where you try to respond true or false to these feelings or behaviors to identify traits, can fall victim to the Barnum effect, also known as the Fourier effect. This is when we tend to accept certain information as true, even if the information is super vague. So of course it's true because it's super vague. If it says something like, you like excitement in life. Well, yeah, like lots of people like excitement in life. What's your definition of exciting? I get excited when an Amazon package shows up at my front door. Is that the same for somebody else? Maybe not. Okay, someone else may be like, I'm going to climb the face of a mountain. I'm like, no, thank you. That's not exciting to me. That's stupid. Okay, and so this can lead to that kind of problem that we have with horoscopes, where you read like, oh, it's Mercury in Gatorade, and so you're going to have a bad date this week. Or you're going to have like this random event, and you're like, oh, it's so vaguely worded that you start, yeah, I said Gatorade. So you start putting in facts to prove it true. It's a bias and hindsight bias there, okay? But from this early personality inventory test, we're eventually going to get a psychometric questionnaire that helps with identifying and diagnosing personality disorders. Okay, that is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is the only scientific, empirically based survey that we have for personality, because it's used as a diagnostic tool. All right, when we did our Wellness Wednesday activity, you'll notice that this was not one of the personality tests available for you. That's because it is used for diagnoses. It's not open to the public. It's a Scantron test given by psychiatrists and other trained officials that they then run through the machine, and it gives them hits on what personality disorder you're showing traits of. Now, that personality disorder could be PTSD, it could be anxiety, it could be OCD, it could be antisocial personality disorder. It can be a number of things, okay, for them to be able to inventory so that they can pinpoint proper treatment. So this is not something that we just do in class, okay, because it's a scientific tool. The other personality inventories y'all did take part in. So first off, the Minnesota Multiphasic. This contains hundreds of true-false statements. Sometimes they even repeat the questions, because that's a mechanism for telling if the person has a self-serving bias. Are they malingering? Are they lying? Or are they actively trying to answer the questions to find out what diagnoses they get? So if you take this Scantron test and it determines that your answers don't match up with previous answers to the same question, they make you take it over again. Okay, this is the most widely used personality test because it can help us identify personality disorders and treatment. It's also used for screening purposes for some jobs, not like, oh, if you want to work at Chick-fil-A or become a teacher, but jobs where you need higher security clearance, okay, is where they would give these multiphasic inventories in order to identify personality traits that may become problematic. Okay, so this is empirically derived. It's based in science. It helps separate people that are neurotypical from people who might show symptoms of depression or anxiety or PTSD or sociopathy, all of those different personality traits that can show up in the DSM-5. Does that make sense so far? The Myers-Briggs version has 16, and it's not this. The Myers-Briggs personality test is not meant for diagnosing, but the Myers-Briggs personality test has little scientific support. It tells you if you're introverted or extroverted, feeling or thinking, intuitive or sensing, judging or perceiving, and that can combine to 16 possible combinations. It's a lot like a horoscope. When you read your results, you're going to say, okay, that could be anybody. That's vague. But you may see some things that you're like, oh, heck yeah, that's definitely me. And that's only going to reinforce your trust in the personality test. Einstein's 2 dimensions of personality, okay, base personality in temperaments that are inborn and unlearned that you get from your parents. They are genetically influenced. That could be extroversion or introversion. Okay, so are your parents outgoing or not outgoing? Neuroticism versus stability. Are you constantly changing or creative, chaotic, or are you consistent? And psychoticism versus socialization. So this is one of the tests that y'all did on the Wellness Wednesday. So if you're melancholic, you're going to be more prone to depression and anxiety, being more introverted and quiet. If you're choleric, you're going to be kind of fidgety, okay, and more impulsive. Sanguine, you're much more outgoing and carefree, like type B personality. Phlegmatic, you're more controlled, even-tempered, and kind of passive rather than feeling a leadership role. Okay, again, this is not diagnosing any psychological differences. It's just trait-based personality tests that they believed, Hans and Sybil Einstein believed, were genetically passed down to children. And then they become stable by the time you become an adult. Now, Paul Costa and Robert McCrae came up with the big 5 personality traits. To remember it, remember the mnemonic device OCEAN. So are you open to experiences? Are you more active? Do you like excitement? This goes back to the Yerkes-Dodson arousal theory. Conscientiousness. Are you self-controlled? Do you have self-discipline? Do you think before you speak or act? Extroversion, obviously, how much do you interact with other people? Agreeableness, how do you get along with other people? And neuroticism, how likely is it for you to experience stress or anxiety or other negative emotions? According to Costa and McCrae, this becomes stable by the time you reach adulthood, but it is influenced by genetics from your parents and has been used to predict possible behavior. Okay? This is the most widely accepted model of the traits in the personality test outside of the Minnesota Multiphasic. But again, doesn't help diagnose anything. It's just a matter of what letters am I? Where do I score on this? Are we good so far? All right. So lastly, the social cognitive perspective. Y'all may remember that the behaviorists were super anti-cognition. Okay, B.F. Skinner was a big time behaviorist. He believed in environmental determinism. What that means is the environment determines who you are. Tabula rasa, to the extreme. You don't think and have free will. There's no free will. You are merely a product of your environment. And so there are 3 factors involved in environmental determinism. The person is impacted by the environment, and that impact shows up in their behavior. Simple as that. Albert Bandura, who is also a behaviorist, is going to say, no, that's a little bit too simplistic. He adds cognition to the idea of behaviorism, like the social learning theory or modeling and observational learning. Remember, he was the one who came up with the Bobo doll experiment, where he said it's not just behavior and modeling of that behavior, there's also cognition involved in it. And how we interpret or think about our environment affects how we behave. Okay, so thinking is involved. So he said that reciprocal determinism was more accurate than environmental determinism. Reciprocal determinism says that your environment has an effect on you, but you also affect your environment. It is a two-way street, as opposed to environmental determinism, which is a one-way street. Okay, so like let's say your environment, your parents are one political party. Well, you're more likely to be that political party. But then you may decide, because you're a part of that political party, to go to a certain school over another. So you're reinforcing your behavior with your decisions, and your environment is changing based on those decisions. Are we good so far? And this can change based on the type of society that you live in, whether it's an individualistic society or a collectivistic society. Now, we've covered this before, so this is just a refresher. Individualistic societies tend to be more common in the West, whereas collectivistic societies tend to be more common in the East. This is the me versus we priority. Who's more important, the individual or the group? Okay, in these notes, if you look at this chart, it talks about the differences between individualistic and collectivistic societies, independent versus interdependent, me versus we. Okay, and so make sure that you review that chart if you're taking the AP exam in May. Again, reciprocal determinism is not just the environment having an effect on you, it's also you having an effect on your environment. So this counters the behavioral perspective, and it adds in cognition. This explains how the same environment can have different effects on different people. So like even if you have two siblings living in the same house, okay, let's say it's an abusive household, it's an abusive environment. Well, one could go on to be a CEO of a company, whereas the other goes on to be in and out of jail. Same genetic code, same environment, same parents, and yet different effects. And so Albert Bandura says it's because of the cognitive aspect of reciprocal determinism. Okay, how they think or interpret or react to that environment affects their behavior, which further affects their environment, which further affects their person. Does that make sense so far? All right, self-efficacy, and I'm trying to rush because I know we're running out of time. Self-efficacy is the belief that you are capable, that you are competent, your belief in your ability to succeed. Okay, higher self-efficacy results in higher self-esteem. Okay, so how do you identify high or low self-efficacy? Well, those with a strong sense of self-efficacy view problems as challenges rather than threats. Okay, something to be mastered. They develop deeper interest in their activities. So even if that activity is difficult at first, they keep practicing and keep doing it. They form a stronger sense of commitment to their activities. Okay, so they're more likely to finish those activities. And then even if they encounter setbacks or disappointments, they tend to recover quickly and try again. Versus those with a weak sense of self-efficacy. They try to avoid challenging tasks because that threatens their identity and their idea of their efficacy. They believe that difficult tasks and situations are beyond their control, so they have an external locus of control. They hyper-focus on setbacks and personal failings and mistakes. And they are quick to lose their confidence in their personal abilities when they experience setbacks. So all this ties to internal versus external locus of control. Locus meaning location, okay, place. Internal locus of control means that you believe you control your destiny. This is where achievement is going to be highest. I control my destiny is internal. External locus of control is they control my destiny. The idea that your fate is outside of your control, and instead of being based on hard work, it's based on luck. Okay, so whereas internal locus says hard work gets rewarded, therefore if I work hard, I can get promoted. External locus of control would say people get promotions not because they work hard or because they deserve the promotion, but because they know the right people. It's all about networking. And that's going to have a much more negative effect on their own self-efficacy. Cognitive expectancy is higher in people with internal locus of control. Cognitive expectancy is the belief that your behavior will result in the desired outcome. That's going to be much higher in people with internal locus of control and high self-efficacy. Okay, so you think it, you be it. If you have external locus of control, then you're more susceptible to learned helplessness. Okay, this is when you give up. Okay, if you are unable to avoid a negative situation, then eventually you give up trying to avoid the negative situation. And so you just put up with whatever situation you're in. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Make sure that you look at this chart and the notes that I've put in that PDF at the end of the lecture series. We've only got a couple more slides left. Example of reciprocal determinism. My parents are liberal. I identify with my parents. That's environment having an effect on you. I therefore choose behavior, a more liberal college to attend. This makes me even more liberal. And attending this college, this new environment, I make students, my friends, more liberal. So that's you having an effect on your environment. I leave school for another environment, another job, working for liberal causes. So you can see how the environment affects that person and how that person then has an effect on their environment. Versus if you're a thrill seeker. Well, if you're a thrill seeker, then you're probably going to seek out people who want the same thing. So you're more likely to take bungee jumping lessons with a group. But you could also be pushing your friends to thrill seek, to get them out of their shell, to take them bungee jumping with you. So your environment having an effect on you and you having an effect on your environment. Does anyone have any questions? All right, then make sure that you're going through these last 3 pages that you can see here in this PDF. It's going to talk about the psychoanalytic theory with Freud, the conscious, the unconscious, the subconscious, id, ego, superego. It's going to talk about defense mechanisms like repression versus suppression, and then also the fixations from youth, the oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, genital stage. And then also Carl Jung, who's not quite as Freud. He like takes down the weirdness a notch, versus Alfred Adler and Karen Horney, who are all a part of the psychoanalytic approach that comes out of Freud's approach. Okay, so this I want y'all to self-study, especially if you are taking the AP exam.